The American surgeon stopped the moment he unwrapped the bandage. The smell alone told him the truth before his eyes did. This wound had been rotting for weeks. And the young German prisoner sitting in front of him had no idea that in a few minutes, the doctor might have to choose between saving the soldier's life or cutting off his leg. Winter, 1945. A freezing wind swept across the muddy fields surrounding the temporary American field hospital somewhere in Western Europe. The war was entering its final, desperate months, and the casualties were arriving faster than the doctors could treat them. Inside the long canvas tents, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, wet wool, and smoke from small iron stoves struggling to keep the cold away. Stretchers lined the narrow walkways. Medics moved quickly between them, calling out injuries, handing instruments, trying to keep pace with the endless stream of wounded men. Not all of them were American. That afternoon, several trucks had arrived carrying German prisoners captured during a brutal firefight earlier that morning. Most of them were young, exhausted soldiers who looked more like frightened boys than hardened enemies. Some stared silently at the ground. Others looked around nervously, unsure how they would be treated now that they were in enemy hands. Despite the tension, the American medical staff followed the same rule they had followed throughout the war: wounded were treated first, questions later. Captain William Holland, one of the senior surgeons in the unit, had been operating for nearly 12 hours straight when a medic approached him with another patient. "German prisoner," the medic said quietly. "Leg wound. Says it's just shrapnel." The prisoner was helped onto the examination table. He looked no older than 22. His uniform was filthy, stiff with dried mud and weeks of sweat from the front lines. A worn machine gunner's belt still hung loosely from his shoulder, though his weapon had long been taken away. He tried to stand straight, despite the clear pain in his posture. "It is small," the young soldier said in broken English, tapping his thigh. "Only metal piece. Just bandage again." Holland didn't answer immediately. He had seen too many battlefield wounds to trust what soldiers thought was small. The bandage around the German's upper leg was dark, stiff, and badly wrapped, the kind of dressing that had clearly not been changed in a long time. Possibly weeks. "That bandage been on there since the front?" Holland asked. The prisoner hesitated. Then he nodded. "Maybe 3 weeks." Several nearby medics exchanged glances. 3 weeks was far too long for a wound in battlefield conditions. Holland pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and reached for the scissors. "Let's take a look." The young German tried to keep his face calm, but his hands tightened on the edge of the metal table. Slowly, the surgeon began cutting away the filthy field dressing. The first layer came off easily. The second layer stuck to the skin. And when the final layer peeled away, the entire room went silent. The wound underneath was black. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The wound was far worse than anyone expected. What should have been a narrow shrapnel cut had turned into something much darker. The flesh around the injury had swollen and hardened, the skin stretched tight and discolored. In the center of the wound, the tissue had turned almost black, and a thin line of yellow infection traced its way outward beneath the skin. The smell hit the room seconds later. One of the younger medics instinctively stepped back. Captain Holland had seen wounds like this before, and he knew exactly what it meant. Infection had been spreading for weeks. Possibly longer. The German prisoner noticed the sudden silence and looked from face to face. "Bad?" he asked quietly. Holland didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer, examining the wound more carefully. With a pair of forceps, he gently pressed along the edges. Thick fluid seeped from the opening. Not good. Not good at all. He glanced toward the medic beside him. Get hot water. More antiseptic, Holland said calmly. And bring the surgical kit. The words made the young German tense. Surgery? He asked quickly. Holland finally met his eyes. If we don't clean this properly, the surgeon said slowly, choosing his words carefully, the infection will reach your blood. The prisoner swallowed. And then? Holland didn't soften the truth. Then you won't survive it. The room fell quiet again. For a moment, the young German stared at the floor, processing what he had just heard. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled into fists against the metal table. For weeks he had marched, fought, and slept in frozen trenches with that wound burning in his leg. Every step had hurt, but there had never been time for proper treatment. A field medic had wrapped it quickly during a chaotic retreat and told him to keep moving. So he had. Day after day. Now he understood the cost. Will you cut the leg? He asked, his voice barely steady. Holland didn't answer right away. Amputation was always a possibility with infections this advanced. If the rot had spread too far, it might be the only way to save the soldier's life. But the surgeon wasn't ready to make that decision yet. Not if I can stop it, Holland said. The medic returned with steaming metal containers and a tray of instruments. The dim operating lamp above the table flickered slightly as it was adjusted. Scalpels. Forceps. Needles. Everything they had in this temporary hospital. Listen carefully, Holland told the prisoner. We need to open the wound and remove the dead tissue. The German's face paled. Anesthesia? He asked. Holland shook his head slightly. Very little. The supplies were limited, and far too many wounded men were waiting outside. The young soldier stared at the instruments for a long moment. Then he slowly nodded. I understand. But as the surgeon began preparing the wound, and the first sting of antiseptic burned into the infected flesh, the prisoner's calm expression finally cracked. For the first time since he had been captured, fear appeared in his eyes. The operating lamp cast a harsh white circle over the metal table. Everywhere else in the tent was dim, filled with moving shadows and the muffled sounds of the overcrowded hospital outside. Somewhere nearby, another patient groaned in pain. Medics hurried past the entrance carrying stretchers. But inside this small corner of the tent, the world had narrowed to one wounded leg. Captain Holland worked quickly. Hold him steady, he told the medics. Two men stepped forward, placing firm hands on the prisoner's shoulders and arms. Not to restrain him like a captive, but to keep him from moving once the procedure began. The young German soldier nodded stiffly. I will not move, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Holland poured antiseptic over the wound. The reaction was immediate. The soldier's entire body tensed as the burning liquid reached the infected tissue. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. But he didn't cry out. Not yet. Holland picked up the scalpel. This will hurt, he said simply. Then he began. The blade opened the swollen skin around the wound, releasing the pressure that had been building inside the infected tissue. Dark fluid spilled out onto the cloth beneath the leg. The German's breathing became sharp and uneven. He clenched his teeth so tightly that his jaw trembled. Still, he tried to stay silent. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet movement of surgical instruments. Then Holland reached deeper. The infection had spread farther than he had hoped. Dead tissue had formed around fragments of metal still buried in the muscle. Forceps, he said. A medic placed the instrument into his hand. Carefully, Holland probed inside the wound until the metal tips touched something solid. A piece of shrapnel. He gripped it and slowly pulled. The fragment came free with a wet sound, dark with dried blood. The German soldier gasped. Another fragment followed. And another. Each one had been tearing at the muscle every time the soldier walked, every time he fought, every time he forced himself to keep moving across the frozen battlefield. The pain was finally too much. A broken cry escaped the prisoner's throat before he could stop it. His body shook as he struggled to breathe. For a moment, the tough young machine gunner who had tried so hard to remain stoic looked less like a soldier and more like a frightened boy. I thought it was small," he whispered hoarsely. Holland didn't stop working. "No," the surgeon said quietly. "This was never small." Another piece of shrapnel clinked into the metal tray. But as Holland examined the wound again, his expression grew more serious. The infection had reached deeper layers of tissue. Much deeper. And if he couldn't stop it now, the leg might still have to come off. Captain Holland paused for a moment, studying the wound under the harsh operating light. The infection had spread deep into the muscle, farther than he had hoped when the procedure began. The tissue around the injury was damaged, swollen, and fragile. One wrong decision now could cost the young soldier his leg, or his life. The German prisoner watched the surgeon's face carefully. Even through the pain, he understood enough to read the expression. "Is it finished?" he asked weakly. Holland didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully removed another patch of dead tissue, working slowly and precisely. The medics stood silently beside him, waiting for instructions. Finally, the surgeon set the scalpel down for a moment and examined the wound again. The infected tissue was gone. The shrapnel fragments had been removed. For the first time since the bandage had been opened, the wound finally looked clean. Holland let out a quiet breath. "We're keeping the leg," he said. One of the medics allowed himself a small smile. The German soldier blinked, as if unsure he had understood correctly. "You will not cut it?" he asked. Holland shook his head. "Not today." Relief washed across the prisoner's face so suddenly that his composure collapsed completely. His shoulders shook as he exhaled, the tension of weeks finally leaving his body. For days he had expected the worst. In the trenches, soldiers whispered about infections like this, about men who woke up to find their legs gone, or who never woke up at all. Yet now the person who had fought hardest to save him was someone he had been trained to see only as an enemy. As the medics began wrapping the leg in clean bandages, the young soldier looked up at Holland again. His voice was quiet. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Why save him? Why spend time and effort on a wounded enemy when dozens of American soldiers were waiting outside? Holland wiped his hands on a cloth and shrugged slightly. "You're wounded," he said simply. "That's enough." Outside the tent, the distant rumble of artillery rolled across the winter sky. The war was still raging. Armies were still fighting across Europe, and thousands of men on both sides would not survive the final months of the conflict. But inside this dim field hospital, something very different had just happened. A young German machine gunner who had expected hatred found himself saved by the steady hands of an American surgeon. Not because they were allies. Not because they spoke the same language. But because, in that moment, one man made a simple decision: to keep another human being alive.